Obviously I'm familiar with this thesis that there was an already evolving hominid species on this planet, and that these humanoids showed up and they tinkered with the genetics of that species to create us. But I have a problem with that thesis. If you take seriously the evidence for nuclear weapons detonations on Mars that John Brandenburg has, put together, this Xenon 129 signature at least 2 locations on Mars that's identical to the kind of signature that we see at thermonuclear weapons detonation sites on Earth. You consider the fact that the ruins in Cydonia are ruins because they were damaged by these nuclear strikes. So that we're not dealing with, let's say, a scenario where there was some kind of a nuclear event on Mars, and then at some time much later than that, a civilization arose and built those structures. No, actually, the nuclear event on Mars was responsible for putting those titanic buildings into this ruined condition that we find them in today. If you take that seriously, and then you put it next to Joe McMoneagle's remote viewing of Mars, wherein he sees these very tall, basically these Nordic people, you have to reach the disturbing conclusion that there was a human civilization. I'm not even going to say humanoid. There was a human civilization on Mars 250 million years ago, because according to Brandenburg, that is the geological date of this thermonuclear event on Mars. One of the interesting things about McMoneagle's remote viewing of Mars is that it seems pretty clear that, when he's describing these, let's call them Martians, waiting for a scout ship to go and find another habitable planet for them, the planet that this scout ship arrives at is Earth. It's an incredibly volatile primordial Earth. And the other interesting thing about that description, and here's where I think Brandenburg gets something very wrong, is that McMoneagle describes people who are so advanced that he keeps getting the impression that he's looking at the future. The civilization that has built the titanic structures that he remote views is a civilization technically far in advance of ours. And for some reason, I don't know, Brandenburg, I guess because he sees pyramids and thinks of ancient Egypt, assumes that the civilization on Mars was primitive and that somebody else dropped nuclear weapons on it. I don't see any reason to think that. I mean, if anything, we ought to be questioning whether civilizations known to history would have been capable of building structures like the Great Pyramid or the Baalbek platform and so forth. Rather, I think that what we're seeing at places like Tiwanaku and Baalbek and Giza are architectural marvels constructed by the same civilization that built those pyramids on Mars, and built, interestingly enough, in the same style. So to go back to your question, if we're dealing with a humanity that was capable of building structures larger than the Great Pyramids of Giza on Mars, whether it's 250 million years ago or 100 million years ago, and those people came here and terraformed a primordial Earth by constructing the moon, and we can go into that in detail, then it's not the case that they tinkered with the genome of an already evolving hominid species on Earth. They are the genetic engineers of the entire matrix of life on this planet. When Joe McMoneagle was viewing Mars in May of 1984 for the CIA at the Monroe Institute, he said that he kept getting the impression that he was in Egypt. And when you think about the remarkable resemblance of the oldest structures in Egypt to the types of structures that we see not only on Mars but also on the moon, because the constructions on the moon are megalithic in nature. They're not metallic glass structures or anything. They're what Ingo Swann described as fabricated stone, which is exactly the impression some people have had of the types of buildings that, jigsaw patterned megalithic constructions in South America, that they're a kind of poured stone. When you look at these kinds of similarities, it boggles the mind how human civilization 250 million years ago on Mars is still building structures, let's say 12,000 years ago in Egypt. Okay? What is going on here? I mean, that is tremendous civilizational stability. And of course, we know within our own historical record, our record of civilizations that have been carefully studied, that ancient Egypt was the most stable, longest lasting of the world historical civilizations. So we seem to be dealing with humans who have a very fixed idea of how the world should be ordered. And and this is what actually disturbs me most about the entire close encounter phenomenon, is that if you really think about UFOs in the context of the idea of a technological singularity, the idea that certain convergent advancements in technology are increasingly accelerating up to the point where they will converge into something like the event horizon of a black hole, and that beyond that vortex, there are sort of like infinite possibilities for the transformation of humanity. It then becomes very disturbing to contemplate the apparent unchanging order, the sterile stability of this civilization that was active on Mars 250 million years ago and that was shaping ancient Egyptian civilization only between 12 and 5,000 years ago. It would appear that humanity, the ancestors who are our progenitors, the custodians, as William Bramley calls them, they have reached some kind of a cultural dead end. And I have to wonder whether that's the problem at the heart of the entire close encounter phenomenon and the manipulation of societies throughout our entire historical record. That really this is a struggle over the question of whether man can become something other than he has been for 250 million years. The people that McMoneagle and Ingo Swann both saw on Mars, presumably, if Brandenburg's data is correct, between 100 and 250 million years ago, those were Homo sapiens sapien. In fact, he got the impression, McMoneagle did, that these were further evolved Homo sapiens sapien. He kept thinking that they're people from the future. And so, the problem is this, not, why did Homo sapiens sapien, which suddenly evolved 45,000 years ago, displace Neanderthal? The problem is, why were these various types of hominids created in the first place? And I think we should look at the situation like this. I mean, I have big problems with Zecharia Sitchin's research. I think there are parts of it that are very speculative and not closely based on any empirical data. However, there is an idea that he has and that other researchers have proposed that makes sense to me, which is that when these so-called Anunnaki came here, they were torn over whether or not to create human slaves to undertake the various projects that they needed to be done. And it would make sense to me that they first attempted to create a race of biological robots using the genes of dinosaurs, and so we get the reptilians, using who knows what other kinds of genes in order to manufacture these gray artificial intelligences as biological robots. And only with the failure of those two species to function effectively did they decide to create some subordinate, much more humanoid class of beings to serve their aims. And so I can imagine that the caste system that we see in place in ancient India, and the extremely hierarchical totalitarian state that we see in ancient Egypt, the pharaonic system, that these are vestiges of some primordial social structure set in place by these Anunnaki that involved castes of different types of hominids created for different purposes. And that really the event that takes place with the hybridization of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, and in fact the hybridization of Homo sapien with a number of different extinct hominids, Denisovans and so on and so forth. That event is what is remembered in myth as the interbreeding of the fallen angels with Adam, with the race of Adam. I think some of the people who are on Mars right now in subterranean facilities are going to relocate to Earth, and it may be that some people on a severely depopulated Earth, and then some people who are currently on Earth will make it to Mars in a very tightly controlled fashion. Does not want man such as he exists, and I'm deliberately using masculine terminology, that Martian form of humanity that came here 250 million years ago, and we should think of it as Martian also in the mythological sense, the cosmic intelligence does not want that to be the form of man that expands into the wider cosmos. And so we are being challenged to transform ourselves. And until we do, we're going to be contained here. We're going to be stuck inside of this control system. We only have a chance if we can deal with the trauma that we've been subjected to in a way that allows us to overpower and overcome our abusers and to become the representatives of humanity rather than allowing them to represent humanity, to continue to define the limits of what man can be. There's a lot of evidence that the moon is artificial, okay? I mean, the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, and it's also at 1/400th the distance between the Earth and the sun, which is why we have solar eclipses. The impact tests carried out by Apollo 12 and 13 in 1969 and 1970 recorded on a seismograph the kind of signature you would get from a hollow object. The moon rang for an hour in the first case and 3 hours in the second case. So it's largely hollow, except for a small metallic core. But consider some other facts about this artificial satellite that's revolving around us. It takes 27.322 days for the moon to orbit the Earth. And the moon also just so happens to be 27.322% the size of the Earth. How is that a coincidence? I mean, okay, let's say the moon being 400 times smaller than the sun and also 1/400th the distance between the Earth and the sun was a coincidence. There's no way you're going to get two coincidences like that. Here's where I'm going with this, is that, I mean, it wasn't just created to be a space station, it was created to terraform this planet. Because without the moon, we would not have this 23-degree misalignment with the ecliptic. The ecliptic, the plane of the sun, would not be misaligned from the celestial equator by 23 degrees. And if that weren't the case, then, we would have a planet without seasons. The planet would be spinning much faster than it is right now. There would be temperature extremes that would not allow for the evolution of complex life. And so basically, in order to make this planet a place that could be habitable for humanoid life form, you would have had to put something like the moon at the orbit that it's at so that you could stabilize the planet and terraform it, I think with the aim of transplanting Martian life to Earth. If the Greys are an artificial intelligence, if the Greys, which I think there's good evidence for that they're robots, they're biological robots. If that's the case, think back to the scale of project that would be required to construct the moon. The humans who came here and constructed the moon would have needed a species of artificial life forms to carry out that project. They would have needed a race of androids. I think that one of the main reasons for the secrecy is that we are dealing with a phenomenon that's inherent to humanity, that the problem we're facing is a human problem, and not so much a question of disclosing contact with extraterrestrial intelligence in the sense of alien species. And, I think that some of the information that has been amassed about the moon and Mars both in terms of photography and sightings and also remote viewing, bears out the thesis that we're dealing with a human presence on the moon in a contemporary time frame, and that this human presence stretches all the way back to hundreds of millions of years ago on Mars. So we are, in effect, embedded inside of a vastly ancient human civilization. You know, if you look at the beings that are described by, let's say, Travis Walton, they are morphologically identical to the kinds of beings that Ingo Swann saw on the moon and the kinds of beings that, say, Joe McMoneagle remote viewed on Mars, because they look like Northern European people. I would say they range from 6 to 9 feet in height, and probably we have more dealings with the ones that are shorter because they blend more easily into the human population, or rather, I should say, into the terrestrial population. One of the problems faced by sovereign authorities on this planet in terms of the disclosure of what's been going on here, in terms of the UFO phenomenon, the quote-unquote close encounter phenomenon, is that actually we're not dealing with something that's coming from very far away and something that is at a safe distance from us. We are dealing with we are surrounded by the intelligence that is responsible for the UFO phenomenon, and it is extended throughout the whole of human history. We're embedded in a larger human context that has been concealed from us. And it's been concealed from us because, the beings behind this phenomenon have a certain social structure and, pattern of political organization that they're intent on maintaining. As Richard Doty taught everybody, one must beware of what comes from military intelligence officers. And, the tactic of disinformation obviously is based on mixing some degree of deception and, fanciful imaginings with a lot of the truth in some cases. And so what I would have to say about this tripartite division of various putatively alien life forms is that when you consider the possibility that not just Homo sapiens, but the biological matrix of this planet may have been engineered by humans who were refugees from Mars and who constructed the moon to stabilize the Earth, then you also have to consider the possibility that reptilians and greys are not aliens. I mean, if this guy is volunteering the information to you that they were told chimeras existed, that all kinds of species had their genomes spliced with one another, and that the human genome was spliced with the genomes of other species, then why wouldn't it be the case that the reptilians, for example, would be the product of genetically splicing, let's say, their own Homo sapiens DNA with some kind of Deinonychus, dinosaur with binocular vision and, at 5 feet height and a pack hunter and so on and so forth. They could easily have created that species. If the greys are an artificial intelligence, if the greys, which I think there's good evidence for that they're robots, they're biological robots. If that's the case, think back to the scale of project that would be required to construct the moon. The humans who came here, and I triple underline that because you were, using the term non-human in recounting what this defense intelligence agent was telling you. The human, or rather, when you were talking about the bases underneath the oceans, I wouldn't say they're non-human bases. The humans who came here and constructed the moon would have needed a species of artificial life forms to carry out that project. They would have needed a race of androids. How do we know that that's not what the greys are? Especially when abductees like Travis Walton and Whitley Strieber on a few occasions have seen these Nordics, quote-unquote Nordics, together with the greys. So I think what we could be looking at here, and also taking into account what you were saying about reptilians claiming this planet is theirs, what we could be looking at here, when you consider a 250 million year time span, is that genetic, I don't want to call them experiments, genetic creations of an elder race of man may have, in some part, rebelled against their parent civilization. And so if there are quote-unquote reptilians or quote-unquote greys who are operating at cross purposes with the Nordics, what this really could be is internal dissension in the context of a single human civilization that is vastly ancient. And that would explain why, in some cases, we see greys working with the Nordics, and in some cases, it seems like they're working at cross purposes to the Nordics. The people that McMoneagle and Ingo Swann both saw on Mars, presumably, if Brandenburg's data is correct, between 100 and 250 million years ago, those were Homo sapiens sapien. In fact, he got the impression, McMoneagle did, that these were further evolved Homo sapiens sapien. He kept thinking that they're people from the future. And so, the problem is this, not, why did Homo sapiens sapien, which suddenly evolved 45,000 years ago, displace Neanderthal? The problem is, why were these various types of hominids created in the first place? And I think we should look at the situation like this. I mean, I have big problems with Zachariah Sitchin's research. I think there are parts of it that are very speculative and not closely based on any empirical data. However, there is an idea that he has and that other researchers have proposed that makes sense to me, which is that when these so-called Anunnaki came here, they were torn over whether or not to create human slaves to undertake the various projects that they needed to be done. And it would make sense to me that they first attempted to create a race of biological robots using the genes of dinosaurs, and so we get the reptilians, using who knows what other kinds of genes in order to manufacture these gray artificial intelligences as biological robots. And only with the failure of those two species to function effectively did they decide to create some subordinate, much more humanoid class of beings to serve their aims. And so I can imagine that the caste system that we see in place in ancient India and the extremely hierarchical totalitarian state that we see in ancient Egypt, the pharaonic system, that these are vestiges of some primordial social structure set in place by these Anunnaki that involved castes of different types of hominids created for different purposes. And that really the event that takes place with the hybridization of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, and in fact the hybridization of Homo sapien with a number of different extinct hominids, Denisovans and so on and so forth, that event is what is remembered in myth as the interbreeding of the fallen angels with Adam, with the race of Adam. As someone who studied parapsychology for a very long time, and as someone who specialized in philosophy of technology, I can easily imagine a civilization, in fact, not that far in advance of ours, refining its manipulation of ESP and psychokinesis and so forth, using advanced technology to a degree that is, properly scientific and being able to do the kinds of things that you are suggesting, but in terms of, not only genetic disguising of themselves, but basically controlled possession of genetically engineered bodies and so forth. None of that troubles me. But what troubles me is the socio-political dimension of this scenario. There are, as we know, a lot of abduction reports of people claiming to have been horribly abused by these reptilians. And it would be really convenient for a, let's say, overlord civilization, I mean, William Bramley calls them custodians, to create a class of beings who they use for some of their most terrible forms of abuse over the population that they govern. If we look at the records of interaction with the intelligence behind the UFO phenomenon that we have in the Bible, that we have in Sanskrit texts going back, thousands of years, the types of beings that are portrayed in, Genesis and in Exodus or in, the Mahabharata are not reptilians or greys. They're humans. They are, very attractive, perfect physical specimens of Homo sapiens. But if you look at the Old Testament, these Elohim, who are referred later in the New Testament to as angels using Greek terminology, these Elohim, they're sadistic genocidal maniacs. Whether it's, the conquest of Jericho, or whether it's, how Moses leads the Israelites through the desert, under the guidance of this cylindrical UFO and so forth. The things they're responsible for, how they socially engineer and manipulate human populations is absolutely horrific. So, angel, quote unquote, sure. I think what happened is that a group of these quote unquote angels broke with the program. And that's when you start to see an attempt to elevate the consciousness of humanity on this planet by intermixing the genes of the engineers with the genes of the engineered species. And I think we're the result of that. Exactly. It's Prometheus and Zeus. It's the Enki Prometheus light bringer figure who wants to actually empower the created species, and then it's the Enlil, Zeus, tyrannical overlord who wants to keep them as a race of slaves. One of the things I used to teach was comparative religion. And so I've studied the Bible pretty deeply, and put it alongside the Gnostic scriptures, and I've also studied Islam, in some depth. And so my conclusion, in a nutshell, it's very hard to summarize years of research in those areas. But my conclusion, in a nutshell, is that there was a struggle over the meaning of Christ, that endured for hundreds of years. A struggle between the Gnostics in Alexandria and the incipient church before it had separated into Catholicism and Orthodoxy. A struggle between the Catholic Church and the Cathar Gnostics in the south of France and adjacent areas. A struggle between the Knights Templar and the church. So, there was a struggle for hundreds of years about who this Christ was. And the church is, I should say, one. The Catholic Church, Orthodoxy, various types of evangelical Protestantism. Their scripture, the Bible that we have, which they all agree on as Holy Scripture, is what prevailed as the narrative. And the Bible is a revealed text, like the Quran. And the very idea of revelation is the idea that some authority from on high is going to give you a prescription, not just a prescription, but a set of commandments and instructions for how you are to live. And if you don't conform to that, you're going to face, the wrath of God. So the very idea of religious revelation is inherently disempowering and fundamentally contradictory to, the cultivation of wisdom and the elevation of human consciousness through self-development and by drawing on our own resources, as a species. And so you see, a fundamental divergence between the revealed religions on the one hand and the wisdom schools like the Buddha Dharma, let's say, or Taoism, or Mithraism, on the other hand, any number of the old mystery schools. So there is this fundamental distinction between two different types of religion. And, to be perfectly honest with you, I think at this point Christ can't be saved from the ways in which religious revelation has been used by what Bramley calls the custodians to manipulate the human population on this planet. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is to promote a shift in our religious orientation as a species toward the Promethean archetype, toward the archetype of, the light bringer and the liberator of humanity, the father who wants to foster the development of his children. And I think that kind of Promethean vision is also in many ways consistent with, let's say, the Buddha Dharma and other, Eastern teachings, perhaps Tantric, Shaivite and Shakti spiritual schools in India and so forth as well. So I think there needs to be this religious shift on the planet if we're going to successfully navigate the challenges of disclosure. And it does not put me at ease when I hear testimony from people like Colonel Corso that the quote-unquote Greys told the U.S. government that they created Christ, and that they have a holographic projection of the crucifixion and so forth. We don't need gods created from above for us anymore. Considering, the behavior of these quote-unquote extraterrestrials, again, when you say that, people think of aliens. These people are human. It makes a great deal of difference when you consider how they've treated humanity since they created humanity. And, sure, there may be a faction that has become an advocate of, the empowerment of mankind. But if you look at the Old Testament, Jehovah is certainly not on that side. Jehovah is, one of these, if not the chief of these custodians. And so when you have Jesus repeatedly identify himself as a representative of the God of the Old Testament within the various Gospels, you have a real problem. And, the Gnostics, of course, rejected that idea. The Gnostics said that, the God of the Old Testament was the demiurge, and that Jesus was here to free us from, the archons of that demiurge. But that version of Christianity lost hundreds of years ago. And so I think at this point, this kind of profound investment in Jesus is one of the most significant reasons why disclosure hasn't taken place, because a disclosure that would make people question whether this person in particular was actually benevolent or whether he was part of some kind of a psychological warfare and social engineering program would be utterly catastrophic for sociopolitics on this planet. Not only in the Western world, but also in the Islamic world. So, that's a problem. And so I would again emphasize the fact that we have had many spiritual teachers on earth. Jesus at this point is an egregore. I mean, Jesus is a psychic projection conjured by the collective unconscious and by the personal subconscious of people for whom that symbol has tremendous meaning. So, sure, one can be saved by that kind of projection from the subconscious. And, it can transform a person's life. That's what a conversion experience is. The problem is that so many people on this planet have that kind of psychic energy focused on structures that may have been created by these overlords in order to manipulate us and disempower us. You want to, go a little bit deeper in terms of the question of Christ. One has to look at the life of Apollonius of Tyana. There was a man whose biography was written by the well-known Roman author Philostratus. There was a man whose birth date is basically the same as that of Jesus, who taught in Judea as a Mithraic Pythagorean philosopher, and who taught in the Aramaic language, and who performed, according to the biography written by Philostratus, the very same miracles attributed to Jesus. There was an attempt to crucify him. He escaped this attempted crucifixion and traveled across the Middle East and ultimately settled down in India, where he went on to to reach old age and be buried there. And interestingly enough, the locals in Kashmir claim that they have the tomb of Jesus there. So, you have to look at something like that in terms of assessing the significance of the story that has been given to us by the church in these canonical Gospels. It's quite possible that we're dealing with a manipulation of events that actually did take place and a kind of overwriting of an avatar-like figure's attempt to raise human consciousness. It's very hard for me to believe that Apollonius of Tyana and Jesus of Nazareth were two different people. One of them is a fake. So these are questions that have to be asked in the context of a phenomenon that has involved nothing but dissimulation and deception and manipulation on the part of the various entities that have been communicating with us. I mean, a prime example of this are the Space Brothers in the 1950s and the kinds of things they told these contactees who they made fools out of. I don't think that the majority of the contactees, Adamski and George Hunt Williamson and Van Tassel and so forth, were con artists. I think that they were being manipulated by what Jacques Vallée calls messengers of deception. So when you're dealing with that degree of consistent deception, going back centuries, and you look at the life of Apollonius of Tyana versus the narrative about Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels, you're going to have to ask yourself some really hard questions. Supposing there is this Jehovah, and by the way, he's Zeus or Indra, it's the sadistic warlord god. He just changed his PR strategy. If there is this Jehovah who plans to reconquer the planet, how do you think that plan would unfold? It would unfold by the second coming of Jesus Christ. That's what will be presented to the population of this planet. And that's why I think investing this kind of psychic energy in Jesus is incredibly dangerous and disempowering. Because regardless of what the reality of that man's life was, I mean, suppose he was actually Apollonius of Tyana, and they just gave him the title Yeshua when he taught in Aramaic in Judea. Adepts from various traditions are able to walk through walls and bilocate. In the biography that Philostratus wrote of Apollonius of Tyana, the guy regularly engaged in bilocation. So that somebody could project himself from out of a shroud that then collapses on itself. You see, these kinds of marvels or wonders are used in order to manipulate people. One of the things about Whitley Strieber, and let me back up for a minute and just say that I read Whitley's works at a very young age, and I got a lot out of reading Whitley's works, and they had a deep impact on my thinking. So I think he's a brilliant writer. One of the things that's puzzled me about Whitley Strieber for all these years is that he has pretty consistently described himself as a devout Catholic. And I was never able to really understand how a person could have the kinds of experiences that he had and write books about vampires and werewolves like The Hunger and The Wolf Inn, and then, profess his faith in Catholicism. So, I think that despite his variety of esoteric interests, in the case of Whitley, we are dealing with someone who always had a very deeply rooted Christian faith. And so it doesn't surprise me all that much that toward the end of his life, he would write a book like this. I mean, we've had deathbed conversions to Christianity from atheists, throughout intellectual history. So that a long-standing Catholic would try to set Jesus into the context of the close encounter phenomenon before the end of his life doesn't really surprise me at all. And do I think that that is a continuation of some long-standing program that the Greys have been unfolding? Sure. Look. Unfortunately, I have to say it is. And in this context, we also have to remember the fact that, Whitley Strieber is another one of those people who has seen the tall whites accompanying the Greys. And he's very clear on the fact that the implant in his ear was inserted by tall European-looking people who were in his house. So, what's going on here, and who's manipulating the situation? Are those, as I'm suggesting, the people who engineered the Greys to begin with, and who have been, playing a good cop, bad cop routine here for us, manipulating us with these Greys and these reptilians in order to defer responsibility for a very long-term, disempowering manipulation of a humanity that they consider subordinate and that they want to continue to be subservient to them. We need to rely on ourselves rather than looking to some external savior. These beings have a bad track record. And it is clear, even from the ancient texts, whether it's the Sanskrit texts or the accounts in Genesis and the Apocalypse and so forth in the Bible, that there's more than one side to this. I mean, there are factions and they're in some kind of a war with one another, and it would appear that there are advocates of humanity in the mix here, a side that I would describe as Promethean in nature. But, part of that Promethean spirit is that you want your children to become independent and self-sufficient. And so I think that, if we want the assistance, if we want to enlist the assistance of a group of beings like that, we need to demonstrate self-reliance and self-determination and reorient ourselves spiritually so that they can back a venture that, they've seen arise organically within the human population. In a way that Bohm understood very well, this cosmos is woven from out of light. It's structured information and in process, which is why he called it not a hologram, but a hollow movement. And there is a cosmic intelligence which is finite, and consequently affords us free will, which is finite but which is guiding the game that's being played in this lattice of light that is our informational computational cosmos, our quantum computational cosmos. I don't think we are quarantined on this planet. I think that our overlords are quarantined in this solar system. I think that the cosmic intelligence does not want man such as he exists, and I'm deliberately using masculine terminology, that Martian form of humanity that came here 250 million years ago, and we should think of it as Martian also in the mythological sense. The cosmic intelligence does not want that to be the form of man that expands into the wider cosmos. And so we are being challenged to transform ourselves. And until we do, we're going to be contained here. We're going to be stuck inside of this control system. To demonstrate that we are capable of arriving at ideas that haven't yet occurred to the highest forms of life and intelligence extant in the cosmos, to make a contribution to the project of infinite creativity and ceaseless innovation. We only have a chance if we can deal with the trauma that we've been subjected to in a way that allows us to overpower and overcome our abusers and to become the representatives of humanity, rather than allowing them to represent humanity, to continue to define the limits of what man can be. I think there are, as I suggested earlier, even within this control system, factions that have attempted to be advocates of humanity and to empower us and encourage our self-determination, the kind of Prometheus Enki side of the whole close encounter phenomenon. But on a higher level, I think that cosmic intelligence wants us to succeed, not out of some, moralistic benevolence or some kind of patronizing sense of love and compassion, but actually, out of its own evolutionary interest, the cosmic intelligence faces the problem of enduring eternally. It's a finite intelligence, but it's looking into the face of eternity. And so what that intelligence needs more than anything else is to continually be inspired, to be surprised by things that it couldn't have anticipated. And so, we have something to offer to that intelligence only to the extent that we are capable of arriving at new ideas and elaborating new visions. And it seems to me that the form of humanity that's been dominant for the last 250 million years has failed at doing that and is at a kind of evolutionary dead end. Well, there's a reason I'm using man when I talk about that form of humanity. And I think that what Shakti, for example, represents in Hindu, in Indian philosophy and theosophy, it's not incidental that force, the creative energy, is depicted as or symbolized as feminine, as the divine feminine. Yeah, it's a feedback loop, but the purpose of the feedback loop is continual development. It's to basically extend the life of this cosmic intelligence, because it becomes nihilistic on a level that we could hardly imagine. And so this feedback loop is aimed at perpetuating creation and increasing the complexity of life as the cosmos continues to evolve. And by the cosmos, I don't just mean this universe, but all of the worlds that there are. When I describe this being as a cosmic intelligence, what I meant to suggest is that it is an evolving intelligence in the context of the transformation of energy. And so intelligence, is very, very commonly contrasted with stupidity, right? I mean, you call a stupid person dense. And so I think it's possible that our cosmos, this lattice of light, this hollow movement, as David Bohm called it, is like a flickering light in the midst of a dark density. And so there's a kind of density that's profoundly stupid. And that the project of this cosmos, which is a quantum computational system, an information processing system, is to generate intelligence in the midst of stupidity. And so I think that, when you look at, for example, the Gathas of Zarathustra, the hymns of Zarathustra, going back 3,000 years, tremendously influential philosophical text, you see this contrast between the creative intelligence, the ever-progressing mind, and the constraining mentality, which he called Ahriman. Ahriman, or Angraminu, was the force of constriction and constraint, and it was opposed by a force of infinite creativity and progression. And so it's possible that what he was describing, what MJ8 was describing, at the rim of the world, the context in which this cosmos is like a flickering light, that is this density that is constrained by its own stupidity. And so basically the project of this cosmic intelligence is negentropic. It's an anti-entropic force that's attempting to overcome that density, to transcend it.